Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Chirag Shahabi-Azad, Senior Director of Research at the Global Risk Institute, and we're glad that you have taken the time to join us today for the final event in our 2026 Macroeconomic Policy Webinar Series, Tariffs, Trade, and Tumult, Seeking New Strategies Amid U.S. Volatility. Before we get started, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and the video will be posted to the GRI website in the next few days. Your microphones are muted to avoid background noise. And if you have a question for our presenter, please submit it through Slido, which will appear on the right side of your screen, or through the WebEx chat. And finally, near the end of the webinar, you'll be asked to fill out our event survey. It is very short, and we thank you in advance for taking a moment to rate today's session. Now, if you were with us for the last 4 webinars in the macro series, you'll know that the impacts of uncertainty due to U.S. tariffs on trade policy have influenced how our guest speakers viewed the macroeconomic environment in Canada. U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods are at their highest point since the Second World War, and the Bank of Canada estimates that U.S. tariff shocks over the past year have shrunk Canada's economy by approximately 1.5%. Simply put, U.S. trade policy is disrupting the Canadian economy by reducing demand for Canadian exports and triggering significant structural changes to the Canadian economy. The recent U.S. Supreme Court decision on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, notwithstanding, it goes without saying that policymakers and economists across the country are eager to uncover any strategy that promises a path to normalizing or at least stabilizing economic relations with our largest trading partner, while recognizing that a return to the old ways is near impossible. As Prime Minister Carney put it bluntly, the old order is not coming back. One thing that is certain, however, is that a prolonged period of tumult will continue to be detrimental to Canada, despite the resilience the Canadian economy has shown so far. To discuss these issues, it is my pleasure to welcome back Christopher Sands, Director of the Center for Canadian Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and co-chair of the SAIS Academy for North America. Chris has recently joined the Brookings Institute as a visiting fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program, where he leads the USMCA initiative. At Brookings, his work focuses on North American trade, economic integration, and the political and institutional dynamics shaping the future of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. He leads the Canada Seminar at the U.S. Department of State's National Foreign Affairs Training Center and the How Washington Works Seminar for the Canada School of Public Service. He is co-editor of several books on Canada-U.S. relations and lead editor of a new encyclopedia of U.S.-Canadian relations due out in 2027. Chris has been one of the leading voices on Canada-U.S. relations, and given the volatility of the last year, we are thrilled to have him with us this morning to hear his insights on the future of Canada-U.S. relations and what we can expect in the next several years. Chris, thank you for joining us this morning, and we're excited to hear your presentation. Please begin.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chirag, and it's nice to be back. I wish I was bringing better news, perhaps news of less risk, but unfortunately it's as bad as ever. I wanted to frame today's discussion as navigating that risk with 2 sort of alternatives, and I think they come straight out of the way we're managing the relationship now. President Trump, in the second Oval Office between himself and Prime Minister Mark Carney, suggested that the Canada-U.S., Canada-the United States were in natural conflict over producing automobiles, over being engaged in a range of economic activity. And Prime Minister Carney pivoted from that and said, I don't think that we're in natural conflict, but we are natural competitors. And as competitors, we'll each win and lose sometimes, but we're all just trying to do the best we can for ourselves. I thought it was a very elegant sort of pivot. I think it also gives us an indication of where the Prime Minister is going and where this relationship is going next. So I'm going to walk through a little bit what I think is the unfinished Trump agenda for the second term, which we'll see playing out somewhat this year and then in the next 2 years as we try to bring to a close the second term. I'll talk a little bit about the role of the U.S. Congress and the courts, why I think that they are having a growing salience. Well, they'll have a growing salience for us in trying to check some of the risk that we're facing. A little bit about where Mark Carney started and where he has tried to go since his initial theory of dealing with the Trump administration did not work out. Then I'll talk a little bit about the election risks in 2026 and some of the trends that we've seen more recently with Donald Trump that may be relevant to our forecasting of where risk will land. So Trump's unfinished agenda. This is interesting. If you think about the last time I met, we talked a little bit about his year zero strategy. This was something that had been raised in conservative circles as initially a book that said a successful presidency starts the year before it begins. So during the campaign, it has to identify the key personnel, short-term agenda so that it hits the ground running, moves nominations through quickly, and then tries to make the most of the first 18 to 24 months of an administration. This is something that clearly had an influence on President Trump's second term, as we talked about last year, giving him a real momentum this time that he lacked in his first term. Whether he has 18 or 24 months really comes down to the quickness with which he's able to get people nominated. And he did a remarkable job, his team did a remarkable job of filling positions quickly with people who, in contrast with the first term, are a bit more loyal to his agenda and are people that he had thoroughly vetted in advance. We're starting to see some of the personnel changes that are inevitable, particularly in a second term, as an indication that the president is not finished yet and wants to accomplish a lot of other changes. So we see some things that have been distinctive here. The rise of the Make America Healthy Again movement, that agenda that has brought into the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for both addressing Obamacare, the Patient Protection Act that we had for healthcare, but also things like vaccines, things like the cost of prescription drugs, a major selling point for him going forward. Also, a kind of recognition now that we need to do serious reform of the Department of Defense, now Department of War's acquisition process. I know if you're on the Canadian side, you're used to hearing complaints about how slow Canada is at military procurement. But I highly recommend for any of you who have the time going back to a speech by Secretary Hegseth earlier this year that talked about the need for acquisition reform in the United States. He called it the Arsenal of Freedom program. And there's a lot there that we may come back to in the Q&A that has to do with how the U.S. feels more quickly a range of military products. Then also there is this desire to see technology unleashed, move forward aggressively on AI, explore quantum computing, try to really open up U.S. technological leadership, very much on the president's agenda. If you'd asked me last year, I would not have predicted that we would be at war in Iran. Obviously, that has been a surprise for us this year. Even after Venezuela, it looked like the president was going to limit his external engagement very carefully, with the Maduro raid being very, very brief, and now sort of in New York courts, but not a prolonged investment in Venezuela itself. Now we're seeing in Iran something that is a stickier problem, and the president is on and off, I think, playing brinksmanship, not so much retreating. I know people like to talk about taco trades. I'm not sure that the president is chickening out. I think he is moving back and forth to try to destabilize the Iranian regime and use maximum leverage against them so that the end point is something that he is comfortable with. Very risky for him, though, given that we have midterm elections coming up. And I think in addition to the midterm elections, which will be very important for the president, if the Democrats take one or the other or both, possibly very outside risk, of the chambers of Congress, the Senate and the House, it will really curtail the president's agenda for the rest of his term. The reason being that there will be impeachments, there will be protests, there will be even less ability to pass legislation. And if you are keeping score, this is a Congress that has struggled to even pass budgets, that gets bogged down easily. Doesn't stop them from having opinions and saying things on the Sunday shows, but in terms of just the legislative machinery, hearings, and so on, Congress has been remarkably quiet, and that's not healthy for the U.S. system, but it is something we've seen. The president also has not had in the second term appointments to the Supreme Court. Obviously, he attended the hearing on birthright citizenship. There are some other important cases that are coming through, but it is possible that the president will have the opportunity to nominate someone else maybe 1 or 2 seats before the end of the year. That's an important power to keep in mind. And the Federal Reserve, as you'll know, following finance, the ousting or non-renewal of Jerome Powell, the lawsuit against one of the members of the Federal Reserve Board trying to encourage her to resign. All of that is creating a lot of uncertainty about how the Fed can continue to operate with independence. So that those are all risk factors that could be game changers for us going forward into 2027. Now, the USMCA review is ongoing. It is an unprecedented process. We have not had a review of this agreement before now. And it's a very important agreement for Canada and the US. Um, the thing that I think has been most telling has really two factors about the USMCA review. The first is that Jameson Greer, the US Trade Representative, has approached the review with the kind of fidelity to congressional process that his predecessor in the first Trump administration, Robert Lighthizer, followed. This is a formula for a more successful USTR because the power of the tariff belongs in Congress and the president executes trade policy. So it's a hybrid organization, less under the executive branch in many ways than other line departments of the federal government. By managing the relationship with key members of Congress, Jameson Greer has been able to very cautiously move forward on the USMCA review without it becoming a major focal point for Republican and Democrat tug of war over trade policy. And this is surprising in a way because this is the agreement that links the United States to the two largest export markets for American products, who, particularly on the manufacturing side, are closely linked with the US economy. And there are a number of us who've been saying to the administration that going into the midterms, if there was one thing you could do that would boost economic outlooks and give, I think, midterm voters a little reason to be favorable to the administration, that would be a trade truce with Canada and Mexico, perhaps embedding a lot of the debates on unresolved issues into the USMCA review. We can talk a little bit about how that USMCA review might play out in the Q&A, but this, where we're setting up now, and Ambassador Greer has sort of signaled this, is that the US is not interested in a full renewal that would give the agreement 16 more years, but it's not interested in withdrawing. The president recently talked about withdrawing. I think that was to try to create a greater willingness on the part of Canada and Mexico to bring forward concessions. In a practical sense, though, the Canadians and Mexicans have read the fact that the US is not thinking of renewing, but is not thinking of withdrawing, as a formula for what the agreement calls for: annual joint reviews like the one we are currently undergoing, each one of which is an opportunity for the US to look for more concessions on trade issues. So as we move towards July 1, which is the date in which we'll hear from each of the three governments how they would like to vote on renewal, withdrawal, or this sort of middle ground of neither, that date will set off the next round of negotiations. And I think the Canadians and the Mexicans very smartly have said, if we're going to be shaken down every year, we're not going to come forward with concessions in year one, unless it's clear that by doing so, we can get off the annual renewal track. I think the president's become frustrated that this is getting bogged down again. We've heard a lot of negative comments about the Canadian negotiations, that they aren't going well. That'll be an interesting issue to watch. I'm a little more optimistic than some people are, but I'll add a little caveat and something that, I hate to assign homework. I know that's a bad professorly habit, and you're all busy, but I would take a look at the March 31st release of the National Trade Estimate. Normally, this is a USTR list of annoying foreign barriers to US trade and investment. It's kind of a target list, if you will, of the things that they acknowledge that have been raised by members of Congress or that they're concerned about, that sets the table for conversations with major countries around the world. And it's a long document, it's about 530 pages this year, but you don't have to read the whole thing because it has a section on a number of countries that it's just sort of country specific. So you'd only need to read the countries that are most important to your business. But I would really encourage you to start with the forward. The introduction of the report lays out something of an operationalization of the Trump administration's approach to trade, with a focus on what they call agreements on reciprocal trade, or ARTs. This is their substitute for free trade agreements, agreements in which the US maintains leverage and there's a baseline tariff applied to all trade that can be then increased or decreased to maintain leverage even over close trading partners. That sets up what could be the worst case scenario for USMCA, which is the breakdown into two agreements in which the US exerts leverage over Canada and Mexico and keeps a certain amount of uncertainty over both and forces us into annual trade negotiations. Even in that scenario, I don't see Canada and Mexico leaving the USMCA. As long as the president doesn't withdraw from it, they'll have a chance to work with a new president in 2029, and that will keep them, I think, at the table so far. But that's something to keep an eye on. We also have some fun this year. The American 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the FIFA World Cup, which will be playing across North America. This was President Trump's idea in the first place. A lot of people have looked at this as either a disaster waiting to happen, high ticket prices, difficulty for certain teams getting into the United States, etc. On the other hand, it was meant to be a celebration in which all three countries were active participants. And given the president's love of a big show, it is also an opportunity for the three leaders to interact and perhaps will give us some goodwill with which we could break through some of the logjam issues in North America. There are also some new world order aftershocks. I talk about this a little bit in some of the things that I've been writing, but issues such as when the G7 meets in 2027, which is coming up, it'll meet in the United States. And what is the approach of the Trump administration to that meeting, which is expected to be held in Miami? Secondly, we have these issues of war and peace. The U.S. Demonstrating that it's still willing to go to war, and even though the markets don't like it, send messages to both China and Russia. But what that means for Ukraine, what that means for Iran and the Middle East neighborhood, what that means even for Greenland, still up in the air. I think those are X factors, and we're watching an administration in real time define the Trump doctrine on war and peace. And I think this is something that we'll be talking about all year. And to the extent that it does consolidate into a doctrine, it's very useful for us as analysts looking at the situation, because it'll give us some sense of the predictability of the administration. It's the uncertainty that's driving, I think, everyone a little around the bend, looking for a way to see through what's bluff and what is bluster, and finding out what is the administration's overall strategy to better assess the risk for various investments and so forth. Then finally, a question of whether the U.S. is going to pursue growth or simply recriminations. And if growth stalls or slows down, will the administration focus on blaming others for the problems rather than blaming ourselves? If you go beyond 2027 to that 2028 scenario, which is just the inside of our near term, then you will expect U.S. politics to focus on the succession to Donald Trump. We already see a certain amount of back and forth between J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Marco Rubio, who's been an outsized member of this administration, partly because of his role as Secretary of State, but partly because of his role as National Security Advisor. He has been involved in many of these major international meetings and debates that the president has had, and has carved out an increasing role for himself in that regard. This is an interesting development in that it positions Marco Rubio in what is always the strongest area for an American president, foreign policy and defense policy, as a spokesperson and as a very visible figure who many of our European allies are more comfortable with than with the president, some of the more MAGA members of this administration. At the same time, many members of Congress on the Republican side have been urging the president to stop focusing on foreign entanglements and to focus instead on the domestic economy. That pressure and the outstanding role that Marco Rubio has had may give us an indication of a kind of pivot where the president this summer, obviously not on the most important issues like the war in Iran, takes a focus on domestic issues in order to boost Republicans in the midterm. He has every reason to do so to avoid endless impeachment entanglements and other fights with Congress second term. Whether his involvement in support of candidates will achieve what he hopes, that's still an open question. But in addition to succession for 2028, we have the LA Olympics coming up. This is something the president is very pleased about, excited about. And you could sort of see this year the 250th, next year the G7, and FIFA this year too, sorry, and then focusing on the Olympics in the end. All big stage big stages in which the president will be able to wrap himself in the flag and really declare victory in his administration and having made America great again. So depending on whether the president really does focus on the negative or focuses on the positive, we could see a very different second 2 years of this second term for the Trump administration. I said I would talk a little bit about Congress and the courts. This is something that I think is underrated by a lot of analysts. I mentioned the National Trade Estimate Report. Earlier this year, we saw the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy released by the administration. Congress has, over the years, created legislation that requires the administration to produce reports that define elements of U.S. strategy. Now, for many administrations, these are less important documents because there's always a certain amount of flexibility and contingency an administration has, particularly if they have a strong political mandate. But for the Trump administration, particularly in the second term, these kinds of reports have helped to define what it is that the worldview of the president is in ways that I think have been very interesting for their impact both on the congressional debate and the public debate, but also on debates within the president's own movement. If you look at the national security strategy, we saw the president lay out his stance on China, which was much more dovish than people thought. The focus on the Western Hemisphere, the harsh scolding of the Europeans, the near marginalization of Africa. And in that report, there were many things raised within the MAGA movement about, is this really the Trump we voted for? Why are we being nice to China? Why are we being hard on Canada and Mexico? What's the point of Greenland and how does that fit into things? I think there were a lot of fissures created by the national security strategy. I think the same will be true on the national trade estimate. There is a list of things that the U.S. It spells out that it wants to go after Canada for and Mexico for, but the polling's been fairly consistent that even Republicans who are general supporters of the president have not seen the connection between the tariffs and the trade war and their own economic livelihood. This is another bit of homework, so bear with me. But if you have the time, you can find on YouTube or on C-SPAN the video of the president's speech at the beginning of the Detroit Auto Show earlier this year. This is an annual event. It used to be bigger when I was a kid in Detroit. Now it's kind of a smaller affair, outclassed by some of the more bigger global shows. But it was still the president going to the Detroit Economic Club and laying out a sort of case for his successful economy. And while the president talked about the big macro things, growth, low inflation, unprecedented deals for investment in the United States, the audience reaction was very different. Why? Because the auto companies that many of them work for are laying off people as they absorb the cost of the shift away from electric vehicles back towards vehicles with internal combustion engines. Because many Canadians are boycotting the United States and not coming over. And in a city like Detroit, many people work for, whether it's the casinos or Tiger Stadium or Ford Field where the Detroit Lions play, etc. They're not coming. And that's hurt restaurants, and that's hurt a lot of hospitality industry, folks who normally benefit from the Canadians being right next door. I think this disconnect between the president talking about the macro economy, but voters thinking more in terms of kitchen table microeconomy issues, is the gap that will either narrow as the president swings into focusing his economic case on ordinary voters, or will widen as the president continues to think big picture. But his voters, and many voters who are independent or key in any midterm election, because they're often the ones who are more willing to swing, start to think that the president has lost the thread, that he's getting the big numbers, but he's not actually focusing on the things that affect the voters. Now, at the same time that you see these congressional reports exposing some of the divisions within the movement, we're also seeing greater pushback, leadership transitions, not only in departments, but into key committees, midterm uncertainty with regard to what party strategy will be in either party, what's their message going into the midterms, how are grassroots organizations and sort of the rank and file cadres of the parties positioning themselves in some of the key swing states and in key races. We've had a series of attempts by states to reapportion seats in order to sort of change boundaries, which normally only happens after a major census. But many states are saying, well, because the previous census counted some people who were not citizens, that was something the Biden administration was willing to allow. We can't rely on those numbers, so we're going to do a different set of numbers. And so far, the court has mixed and matched in its response to this. The courts have. Some of these issues will end up before the Supreme Court, but many of those issues are kind of creating a cloud over what will happen in the midterm and whether people will be confident that the midterms will produce a result that reflects the will of the people. You can look at some of the cases, in particular Georgia, about potential voter fraud and irregularities, not only in the 2020 election about which the president spread cross, but also in subsequent elections as part of this extended battle over the confidence we have in the voting system. Uh, it comes down to something which I think is important to emphasize here, which is the lack of trust in institutions. And if you're Canadian watching this discussion, you'll know there's also a lack of trust between Canadians and American institutions and American leadership, and also the American commitment when we make a pledge to Canada that we'll follow through on it. Trust is actually the biggest loss that we have across the board in US government. And that lack of trust means there's a greater degree of uncertainty built in, and also a greater degree of skepticism on the part of investors, but also voters, that what looks to be the sure thing or the likely trajectory will really hold. And the president loves that uncertainty, but as you know, it's bad for markets, and it's held a lot of money outside productive investment and modernization of physical plants. That's Instead, they're in liquid investments so that if the conditions change, they're able to pivot quickly. I think that's why the markets do well, but it's also a challenge for the US economy, the Canadian economy, addressing competitiveness challenges while we're facing so much uncertainty about what the administration's policy is, what the tariff rate's going to be on any given day, all of which is problematic. But we've also seen something interesting, and I bear with me on a little bit of a history lesson because I know some of you will not remember, as I do, the Nixon administration. In the Nixon administration, we saw what was probably the only previous analog to the current moment in the US-Canada relationship. President Nixon believed that he spoke for what he called the silent majority, a lot of whom were blue-collar workers who felt that the fancy pants elites in the East and West Coasts of the United States had been running things at their expense. They were anti-communist, probably a little conservative socially, and they felt hard hit by many of the global economic challenges they faced, particularly by exchange rates, which both Japan and Germany were manipulating using old Bretton Woods formulas in order to have lower currencies so that Americans would buy more of their exports, but it also forced the US dollar higher than certainly Nixon wanted it, or Secretary of Treasury John Connolly wanted it. And that was difficult because it meant that the US export machine was becoming much smaller, and many industries that relied on export markets lost those international markets. It was also true that President Nixon was fighting the Vietnam War largely without the Allies and maintaining the biggest costs during the Cold War, that era's version of great power rivalry, and asking the Allies to spend more on defense while they, for the most part, that includes Canada, spent money on social programs instead and were critical of the Vietnam War as well. This was a difficult period, and President Nixon decided to respond to this quite violently. He pulled the US off the gold standard. He moved to put a 10% import surcharge on all things coming in. Now, that didn't last very long, but it was a shock to the system, both the economic system, but also traditional allied relationships. What came after that was, of course, the Watergate scandal, which drove President Nixon from office. For many Canadians, for many US international partners, the sort of driving out of Richard Nixon was his comeuppance. He was a bad actor. We were glad to see him go. But I think it's important to recognize what followed that period, which was a reaction against what was called then the imperial presidency, and two presidents, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, who worked to try to restore confidence in Americans' institutions, to put, for example, with Carter, human rights at the center of American foreign policy. In the case of Gerald Ford, personally a very honest, uncharismatic figure who tried to focus on the support for American institutions, showing that with the Watergate prosecutions, that the American system had essentially worked. Those two presidents, often regarded as two of the weaker presidents in US history, nonetheless were a healing moment. And I would call out President Ford, not just because he's from Michigan and I'm from Michigan, but President Ford, who interestingly gave us the 1974 Trade Act, which contains 301, 201, 122, several of the major tariff measures that the president has, and some of the least disruptive ones. President Ford also boosted the G4 to become the G7, with Canada and Italy joining at the same time, broadening that coalition. Similarly, under President Carter, we saw creation of new federal departments and a focus on ethics in government that we had not seen for a while. Both of those presidencies were quick and transient, but they really helped restore the US on its constitutional track. The reason I mention that is I think we need to anticipate in 2029 the possibility that the US will again turn to figures for the next presidency who are not necessarily Trump like, but are perhaps more buttoned down, more normal, not perhaps the big, larger than life figures that we've had in recent years, perhaps some very dull ones, but that is could be part of the healing process. And I think many of the things we've talked about hoping for, whether it's a revision of the WTO, reform that would put it back in good shape, other changes to globalization, there's plenty of scope for that, but it will depend a little bit on the outcome. I think many people are guessing, well, it'll be Rubio or it'll be Vance. It'll be someone who is a bit more Trump-like, or it'll be a Democrat like Gavin Newsom or someone who brings a little bit of color to the job. I'm not so sure. And I think history suggests there might be a different path. It won't be a strong-handed path, but it might be one to a better place. So we can talk about that in the break. Now, if I ever worry about talking politics in this town, I shouldn't, because Republicans and Democrats are equally morose about their various prospects and angry about the other side. I know that's truly bipartisan because everyone has their flaws and both parties exist to point out the flaws in each other, but they're actually turning inward because we're seeing the baby boom generation move into retirement. Their effect on politics will be studied for years. It's quite profound, but we're all trying to get a bead on the millennial voter, the Generation Z voter, or Z, everywhere else but the US, and what they're looking for from an economy that doesn't actually work very well for young people, whether it's access to housing, starting a family, etc. So this concern, I think, will change a lot of the political issues that we're seeing today, and the desire for stability that we're hoping for from the market perspective, I think will be something that a lot of ordinary voters will be looking for from those earlier generations. There are also some things that the president has abandoned, things that he's decided not to chase down, including some of the prosecution of his various enemies using the Justice Department. He seems to be climbing down on some of that after Pam Bondi's defenestration. Some of the more aggressive ICE raids on immigration, I think the president sort of recognized that's not helping him. He needs to take a step back. So those kinds of shifts raise the question of whether the president is simply being tactical, trying to pull back to shore up his support before going back to the previous policy, or whether it's a strategic shift to recognize that that idea no longer appeals to him. He's best to pivot his time and energy to other places. That's an open question on some of these issues. I think it's tactical until proven strategic, and we'll see where we are after the midterms. Promised to talk a little bit about Mark Carney, and I'm very sympathetic to him because I think he's had a really interesting 12 months. Maybe that's the understatement of the year. First, he came into office with a plan, having declared that Canada's relations had suffered a rupture, to replace the understandings we had, many of which were tacit between Canada and the United States, with a security and economic agreement that would leverage Canada's role as a partner in NATO and in NORAD as a defense and security partner that is far superior and more integrated with the US than the Mexicans are on whether anything from the police all the way up to the military. And by showing strength there, set the table for an economic understanding that was a little bit less contentious. That clearly has not worked. And I think the frustration for many of us is that Prime Minister Carney put forward a number of non-contingent concessions, spending 2% on defense in the current year, investing in border security, creating a fentanyl czar, getting rid of the digital services tax, all of which were designed to set the table for this conversation, which it appears Doug Ford's ad quoting Ronald Reagan derailed, and we haven't been able to get them back on track. And so we are, in a way, at sea. And you're regularly hearing from administration officials that Canada's behind. Canada's not easy to negotiate with. They're not being creative. And I think it's created a lot of frustration in Ottawa, certainly some frustration on Capitol Hill, because they'd like to see the relationship with Canada be better, but they aren't seeing that yet. Now, I mentioned at the outset, what Carney has done is to sort of shift from that conflict paradigm to a competition paradigm, and it served him well. We all remember before his speech in Davos, the prime minister's visit to China, where he was able to unblock commodity exports in agriculture in exchange for being willing to have a managed trade, limited quota, 49,000 Chinese made electric vehicles enter the Canadian market. It was a signal that he could find other partners, but it was a very calibrated signal. It was not a wholesale import of a large number of vehicles. It came with the caveat that they had to be eligible to be sold in Canada because they met our Canadian safety standards, which means they'll all be Teslas, basically, which is fine. But the prime minister had gone from the sort of crack up of talks on steel and aluminum and energy with senior members of the Trump administration to those talks being canceled after the Ford ad to proposing that he and Trump talk about this at the APEC summit that was in Korea. When the president declared publicly he had no time to meet with Mark Carney, Carney reached out to Xi Jinping, which was the start last November of the dialogue that led to the breakthrough conversation before the prime minister then went to Qatar and then finally to Davos, where he gave the speech that we all remember. Prime Minister is trying to create a certain amount of tactical maneuverability, or if you like, some options for himself, depending on the mercurial attitude of the president, so that he's able to position Canada as well as possible. And it's something that he has said that I think is largely misunderstood. He's talked about diversifying Canadian trade. For some people, that translates into trading less with the United States. But the way the prime minister has framed it, he's wanted to trade more with other people and grow the extent to which Canada's economy is engaged with the international economy. The first piece of that is the commodity economy, because commodities are priced out of the market very easily if the US applies a tariff, but they're fungible and there are other parts of the world that would like to see them. Starting with energy, but also following up with anything from traditional natural resources to potentially, if things go badly, even critical minerals. Canada's positioning itself to move commodities globally and to be a global commodity player, while at the same time it pursues the USMCA review. Why? Because if commodities and natural resources and primary products are mainstay of the Canadian economy, so too is manufacturing. Everything from autos to aviation to processing food and food products. This is the heart of the Canadian economy, particularly as we think about it in Ontario, for which the USMCA is vital. And then the final third of the economy, or sort of third bucket I often think about, is services. Services are thriving. They haven't really had tariffs applied to them. They haven't been the target of a lot of disruption. So services are okay. So Prime Minister's strategy is to keep conversations going, to grow Canada's trade by 300 billion, mainly through commodity exports, but maintain, to the extent he can, U.S. market access. It's a carefully balanced strategy, but one I think that he's really mapped out well and will hopefully succeed in. Something else which has come up, which I think complicates Mark Carney's life, but also the US life, is an historical lesson forgotten. After, in the very beginning of the 20th century, the United States had an encounter with what it thought of as incipient Canadian nationalism, which meant a national identity separate from the British that might potentially mean that Canada would become less well integrated in the British Empire. And the US encouraged that, only to find in the 1911 reciprocity election that nationalism had given Canadians the sense that perhaps they shouldn't be dominated by the US either. Post 1911, US administrations chose to promote Canadian sovereignty, which did provide some distance between Ottawa and London, at the same time that it promoted economic integration. Nationalism proved to be volatile and dangerous, whereas sovereignty was much more compatible with US national interests. Now, that lesson was sort of baked into US Canada relations so well that it almost never got talked about. But what the Trump administration has done by reviving kind of passionate Canadian nationalism is rediscovered why that is so bad for US interests and for closer integration. And the challenge for Mark Carney, not being a dyed in the wool career politician, will be to manage the force that has been unleashed in Canada of sort of passionate nationalism and resentment against the United States. I think that's an important factor. I think it's largely the US that's put itself in this bad position, but we're not great at knowing here in Washington how the US Canada relationship works. I'm sadly the only people doing this kind of work. And so everyone should take my class. That's all I can say. But at the same time, it will take us a while to rediscover this. At the same time, that it will take a while for us to restore trust between the two countries. And I see the only path forward being incremental, which will entail a certain amount of risk as we move in that direction. Now, Mark Carney's predicted a middle power moment, and I'm actually very favorable to this. The idea that as great powers focus on great power rivalry, it's the middle powers that have the ability to hang on to the rules-based order to the extent that they can. I don't think that's a pie in the sky goal. I also don't think that Canada is doing so as a sort of rebellion against American leadership. It's not trying to find new best friends, but it is recognizing that many states in the international system depend on what has up till now been a Pax Americana, an American-led world order that is worth keeping together. If Mark Carney and others are able to keep bits of this system together, whether it's addressing climate change or trying to stabilize the international financial system, these things will redound to the benefit of future U.S. presidents, who I think will find an ability to retake up the reins of that order and work with its natural allies, but only if we have a president who has the wisdom to see that. And I think this is one of the sort of key moments, but for the U.S. to think about what it's willing to sacrifice to remain a global leader. Right now, acting much more like China and Russia than it is traditionally done. I think Mark Carney's effort, which is not anti-American, has been all to the good. But what the prime minister is looking for overall, whether it's the middle power moment or his strategy with the United States, is a path to a deal, or at least a safe harbor, that will let him outlast President Trump. And President Trump, I'm convinced, is not going to be president in 2029. And that means we have a near-term window that, if Canada can manage itself till that point, will prove to be the best he can do to kind of stabilize things until that period's over. Now, the big risks come with elections this year, and I'll point out just a couple of them. Obviously, midterms are coming into focus. We're going to see midterm election outcomes affect the Trump administration's second term one way or another. We have another large wave of retirees from Congress this cycle, creating a certain amount of expectation of change, even if the partisan division is similar. Also, we have potential for Canadian elections in the form of an Alberta referendum. There'll be a Quebec provincial election, which will be important, likely to raise Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon to office as a PQ premier. He has promised a referendum on independence, even though the support for that is fairly low, as it is in Alberta. But I think wisely has said, not while Donald Trump is president, to give a sort of nod to Canadian unity, which I think is a smart move. But those two referenda, particularly U.S. intervention, as we saw with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, talking about Alberta independence in a sort of supportive way, this is a wild card that I think could backfire against the administration quite sharply. At the same time, we're seeing new leaders, a new leader of the NDP, Avi Lewis, coming in. We're going to see other change, perhaps a change in the leadership of the Conservative Party. We could talk about that if you're interested down the road. And I think there's also a wild card for Mark Carney in a federal election call. I know he's been picking off votes. He's at 171. He needs just one more vote, and we have some by-elections coming up next week that could be enough to tip him over. I think they'll be talking about that at the Liberal Convention in Montreal this weekend. But at the same time, that will get him inched north of 50%. An election, most polls show, would give him a more substantial majority. And I think the prime minister believes not only is that good for himself, but a second election that gave him a more substantial majority would also give him a new look with Trump. Trump has tended to respect leaders who win by good-sized margins, as he did with Keir Starmer, at least until Keir Starmer started losing his grip on the British government. I think the calculation from Carney may be that it's worth taking the risk of an election, that he'll get a strong endorsement, and it'll strengthen his hand in the final years of the Trump administration. But we'll see. Be very interested in what you all think. Then last, not to keep it off the radar, because I think it is important, the Mexican midterms coming up in 2027. I mostly talk about Canada, US, but the thing about Mexico is that we have in Claudia Sheinbaum someone who has been in the shadow of AMLO, has nonetheless governed as a sort of cautious technocrat, managed her relationship with the US a bit carefully, but with some success, has approached the USMCA review, even though she's not a big fan of the agreement, trying to make sure that Mexican interests are maximized. The question is, do voters support the Morena party in the election, maintaining the supermajority that she has to work with in the Mexican Chamber of Deputies and the Mexican Senate? Or do we see her final 3 years weakened by the fact that she loses control of all or some of the Mexican Congress? And some of Morena's smaller party allies who've helped it with its supermajority have shown recently some sign that they want to break free, act more independently. That's a factor to watch in Mexico, and I think something that is off radar for people because it's still more than a year out, and we're all distracted by what's going on in the U.S. and Canada. But bears watching. So last among least, some Trump trends, and this is where I'll close because I'd love to hear from you and your questions. First, I think we're going to see some Trump shocks facing more important counters. That is to say, Congress perhaps reasserting in the space, the Supreme Court reasserting in the space, new critics coming forward, perhaps trying to improve their chances in upcoming US elections by gaining some notoriety by fighting Trump in his waning years. There's almost always that lame duck effect, even if you try to avoid it. The fact that the president won't be on the ballot in 2028, once we're past the midterms, will reduce to some extent his salience, but not as a sort of figure against which you can test your message and win support for the American people by appearing to oppose him at a weaker point. We're also seeing U.S. civil service deterioration at a rapid rate. Part of that is baby boomer retirements, but we've also seen early retirements of a number of officials who have been offered a sweetheart deal to retire early, and we've seen firings led by the dojing that we saw mostly in 2025. What that is already producing are civil service failures, called lack of trust in government administration of basic programs, including Medicare and Medicaid. Note the discussions we're now having about fraud in those programs, which are rising, discussions about irregularities in the way in which Customs and Border Protection, TSA, and others are enforcing federal law. I think we'll see a period where confidence in our government's ability to do things will be undermined by our shakeup in the civil service and driving away a lot of talent from the civil service. And we won't replace people leaving now one-to-one. The only time in my life that we've seen a reduction in the size of the federal workforce was during the Bill Clinton administration, where it was the retirement of the World War II generation that gave him the opportunity first to get rid of some senior people, but second, because of the personal computer and the internet, he was able to not rehire one for one, but actually reduce the size of the workforce. I think AI will give us increasingly the option to not replace people one-to-one, with important ramifications for how government services are delivered. It's going to be a bumpy period. We'll get it right eventually, but I think it may be a really interesting concern and risk factor going forward. Some of our battered institutions are going to hold, but some of them will fold. So we should watch the institutional strength of the economy. We've got macro versus micro vibes. I mentioned those earlier. There is a great American sort as the millennials and Generation Z rise up. What happens to the world order after Trump? And my last sort of point, it's something that I try to bring up in my talks all the time. We only established direct diplomatic relations between Canada and the United States in 1927, because that was when the British finally would allow Canada to have its own ambassador in Washington. That was before the Statute of Westminster gave Canada the right to its own foreign policy in 1931. The significance of that is that we're about to enter the second century of the Canada-US relationship, and while crisis is always a time to revisit the pillars of that relationship, Additionally, I think it's a time to think creatively about where we would like this relationship to evolve. And with that, let me stop. I promise time for questions. I haven't left very much. Sorry to ramble, but I'm going to turn it back over to Shruk to take the lead.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts. This is a big topic. It's a very important issue, and I think we could have spent the entire morning going through some of the issues that you've highlighted. So we have about 10 minutes left for the Q&A session. Let me start with this then. Given the U.S. political revolution, and I think really by all measures this has been a political revolution under President Trump, how should Canada's long-standing assumptions about continental security and economic integration change? Can we essentially expect to write this out, or just wait it out, play nice for the next 3 years, expecting for a change, perhaps in the governing party with the President Newsom, or even if Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance succeed? Um, has this caused a permanent rupture, this breaking of the bonds and the breaking of the trust, or can we return to something that resembled the normalcy of the past?
So that's a very good question. I think it's in a way it's the central question. I would say the first step is that Canadians and Americans normally their friendship is the core of this relationship, and we've gone through a period in which Canadians have been insulted and riled up by the president. But most Americans, even border state Americans, have reacted with saying, "Well, that's Trump being Trump. He always thinks he's funny." They haven't really taken it seriously. The first step is to restore trust at the public side, and I think there's more potential for this than people realize. The American public always backs a winner. If Trump's doing great, they're fine. But as Trump starts to fade out, I think people will look for more and more opportunities to distance themselves from him. We saw this with the House of Representatives and later the Senate voting in favor of a legislation or a sort of sense of the Congress declaration that the economic emergency that Trump had used to declare tariffs on Canada, and this was right before the Supreme Court took IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, off the table for the president, but that there was no emergency in the first place. Now, they didn't do that globally. They only focused on the Canada-US relationship, but that's a sign of the kind of rebellion that will come. Gestures like that suggest that there are sensible Americans and that we still value Canada, that's the beginning of the pivot. And I think there's plenty of room for that. It won't be easy. It'll be incremental, but I do think that that is still worth pursuing. And if the public better appreciates the importance of the Canadian relationship and good relations with Canada, that will redound to the politicians following. I know we're supposed to think of politicians as leaders, but I think in this case they're followers, and they will follow where the public seems to want to go.
During your presentation, you'd suggested that the U.S. keeps seeking concessions from Canada and Mexico, which implies sort of an unequal bargaining strengths. What about Canada? Does Canada have any strengths to leverage, I guess? Can Canada seek some concessions from the United States as we go into the CUSMA negotiations?
It will be difficult. And it's partly difficult because Canada's smaller and depends on the US economy, and there's no short term fix for that. The one advantage that Canada has, I think, in the current environment is that Mark Carney's in a position and Canadians are in a mental headspace that they're willing to take some hits in order to stand up for Canada. And I think that is one of the reasons that Prime Minister has been reluctant to make massive concessions going in just to please Trump so that he can get USMCA restored as it was. It doesn't pay economically. And this is where I think Carney has played this very wisely. The more Trump beats up on him, the stronger he is politically at home. There's nobody's going to blame Mark Carney for failing to try or put good ideas forward. If there's one thing that I would maybe recommend that the Prime Minister consider and that Canadians consider is the ability to put forward an idea. If you look at the post-World War II era, sometimes the US reached out to Canada and said, "Hey, would you help us with this?" Whether it's formation of the United Nations, etc. Other times Canada said, we could really use a military coordination committee, a permanent joint board on defense. What about an auto pact? And so I think Canadian agency is stronger than it looks. And although the president obviously was annoyed by Justin Trudeau, he obviously has some bee in his bonnet about Canada generally. I think if Canada comes forward with beneficial ideas that sort of lock in certainty, if you think of the relationship as having institutions, it also has rules and then it has norms. All of those can be reinforced by Canadian initiatives that are in our mutual interest. Right now, I know a lot of Canadians say, I'm not offering anything nice to the Americans. They're such jerks. Fair, but maybe you have more ability to shape that than you think. And a sensible, as the New York Times used to call the most boring headline ever, worthwhile Canadian initiatives are actually maybe more potent now and will resonate better with Americans and can lock in some of the aspects of the relationship that we've maybe for too long allowed to be informal.
So on the negotiations then, for CUSMA, how is this review? And I think this is going to be a bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So in your view, how is CUSMA likely to unfold, and what are the realistic worst case outcomes, and what sort of contingency strategies should Canadian exporters adopt? There was an article, Royal Bank of Canada put out an analysis very recently. The headline is, the preservation of CUSMA is economically critical to Canada. So obviously we need this to succeed more than the Americans do. And what is the likely worst case scenario outcome in your view?
Well, I'll throw out a commercial because I have an unfinished answer here. I'm sitting talking to you from the Brookings Institution, and at Brookings, we are launching as part of our USMCA initiative an attempt to cost out various scenarios, including the no USMCA scenario, the two bilateral agreement scenarios, those kind of things. And the goal is to create a number for the loss to the US economy that would come from these scenarios and have that number stand up to scrutiny. Obviously, we can't predict. I mean, there are a lot of variables, but to be able to tell our fellow Americans here what the stakes are. So that I think will help answer your question, but I can tell you we haven't done our homework yet, so we're still working on that. Stay tuned. Happy to share that with you and then through you with everyone on the call. The second thing I would say is, to me, the worst case scenario is now the one that I think markets are buying into, which is that we're going to have annual shakedowns of the Canada and Mexico to make new concessions every year, in which case the true worst is that Canada makes a concession that really locks in a disadvantage. And where I look at the agreement, the one area where that could happen in particular has to do with the rule of origin. The rule of origin is how you qualify for tariff-free treatment. And the US, in Canada's free trade, tried to ban Canadian content because we didn't like domestic content rules. Now we're reintroducing that concept. And the idea that, say, the 75% threshold for automotive could be 75% of which 50% would have to originate in the United States would be a huge blow to Canada and Mexico's participation in the higher value end of that economy. You could see though that happening at a lower level as well. New restrictions on temporary entry, the TN visa, some of the intercompany transferee visas, those kinds of things that would sort of shake up what we've relied on for so long would have a huge impact on the Canadian economy, and yet I think are possible and things that the administration would look for. In the sort of agreements on reciprocal trade that the NTE laid out as an objective for the administration, the idea that we would just replace the USMCA with two separate agreements that preserve American leverage would be another version of the worst case scenario. But in that case, Canada and Mexico would retain many of the features of USMCA by their joint membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And although we wouldn't have, between Canada and the US, NAFTA to fall back on because we eliminated it, just as a World Trade Organization dispute eliminated the Auto Pact, we didn't eliminate the Canada's Free Trade Agreement. So there is a scenario in which we blow up the USMCA, but we fall back on earlier structures that allow us to preserve some degree of this trade relationship. But that puts a lot of weight on the 2028 election, which may or may not give us a different administration that's willing to rebuild institutions. Canada, as a middle power, relies on the rule of law because it can't make the rules by itself. And that's true for anybody in the middle class and societies as well. Middle powers like middle class, you have to work in a rule of law system. So the biggest risk we have is greater uncertainty and less respect for the rule of law. And I would point to something that I think should be on top of Canada's agenda. The dispute resolution process rejected the American interpretation of the automotive rule of origin very quickly in 2020. and it remains a decision that the US refuses to implement. And that is a blow to the rule of law. You may not like the way these panels work, but if we don't abide by decisions that go against us, or at least try to find a workaround, which we do usually on softwood lumber, I think that's a threat to the system that's bigger than anything that'll happen.
Thank you. As we hit the 1 hour mark and bring the session to a close, I would like to thank Christopher Sands for joining us today to share his unique perspectives on Canada-US relations, trade policy, and the ongoing CUSMA negotiations.